So Dr. Kathryn Grow Allen is an archaeologist and anthropologist who has been a professor of anthropology for over a decade. She now owns her own consulting company called Modern Anthro-Consulting. Katie has worked on projects around the world, helping to protect places of heritage and encouraging communities to see them as legacies inherited from the past and to be passed on to the future. So please join me in welcoming Katie Allen for her brown bag talk. Thank you, Carleen.
Okay, so as per usual, I have more that I want to share than time to share it. So what I'm going to do is kind of give a very, very high level overview of a bunch of different projects. And I'm happy to field questions at the end for if you guys want to dive a little bit deeper into one of them. And then I'll also end with perhaps some questions about whether some of these ideas or approaches to heritage would work in the North Country as well. So. That's working. There we go. So I start usually with a dictionary definition of heritage. I do this because I actually, I think in some ways I consider heritage a little bit differently than others. It is often the focus is often on the past, but I like to remind everyone that the definition of heritage also includes the present and the future, right? So it is something that we've inherited from the past and or something that we are creating in the present, leaving behind in the present that could be left for the future, right? So I really heavily focused on all three timescales, past, present, and future, when using the word heritage. In my work, UNESCO is kind of the big heavy hitter. They really popularized the word heritage with their definitions. And UNESCO, or the United Nations Education, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, they separate heritage out by natural and cultural, right? So these are long definitions, but basically I just want to show that heritage can be both natural in form, such as an ecosystem for an endangered species or a unique area of the world. It can be cultural, like we think of ruins, an archaeological site, a historic building, an example of unique architecture, or it can be both, right? And I would also argue that in a lot of cases these days, it is often both. Even the most natural seeming place is often imbued with a lot of cultural history and legacy. They also separate out tangible versus intangible heritage, which I like to remind people of, because we also tend to think of heritage as physical things, artifacts that have been found from the past, a place that has ruins or some event happened on it. We forget about the intangible heritage, right? What we've inherited from the past that we can't touch. This can be sets of knowledge. This can be ways of doing things. These can be perspectives or opinions or views of things. Those can be inherited from the past. They also, our current intangible, aspects of life are things that we're going to leave to the future as well. Right. And so all of these come into play to show that heritage is actually this really, really big, monstrous thing that can look very different in different places. Just to show you, this might be recognizable, but a lot of people, when they think of heritage as cultural and natural heritage, they do think of the UNESCO grand sites, the Taj Mahal, right? The Colosseum, right? These are the World Heritage Sites that have been inscribed by UNESCO. Right. In order to do that, you go through a multi-year process, and you have to prove that this place is of outstanding universal value around the world. Right. But this is far from the only type of heritage there is. In fact, by and large, most heritage around the world will never be on the World Heritage List, either because it's smaller in scale or because of logistics. Right. To actually, it's not a coincidence that some of the areas that are heavily dotted on that map have a lot of professionals who work in the heritage industry. They have degree programs at universities that train people in archaeology and history and anthropology, right? And so capacity is an issue if it takes a couple years and people to put together this very in-depth heritage and history document for the United Nations. If you don't have that capacity, you're going to be less likely to have the dots on the map that represent. So while these are major heavy hitters in the heritage world, they are far from the only ones. The same thing with intangible heritage. The UN has started to pay more attention to the intangible heritage. This is a map you can find online where you can kind of push these little bubbles and they enlarge and give you information about rituals or dances or music, ways of playing musical instruments that have been inscribed by the United Nations as intangible heritage. They had to go through a similar process. They had to prove universal value. And because of that, they have all sorts of extra protections and attention from the world because they are on the UNESCO Intangible Heritage site list. Okay, so as I mentioned, there is considerable off the list heritage, right? And actually, by and large, most of what I do is off the list heritage, right? These are not UNESCO world sites. These are not intangible knowledge sets that have been inscribed, but they are very valuable and very powerful lines of heritage nonetheless. Okay, so where it all began. So surprisingly, my journey in heritage started in a surprising spot. So I was doing my PhD research in Eastern Europe, in Romania, Hungary, and Croatia. And I was there with a very academic question, as I had to be. Nobody on my committee would allow me to have anything but a very academic, scientifically led question, right? And so I had this big thesis and I was collecting data, right? And it had to do with this question of history, right? And the Ottoman or the Islamic history of these countries in Eastern Europe. It quickly became apparent to me that I was actually far more interested in something else, something that wasn't in my academic question and wasn't the focus of what my committee wanted, right? And that was how this period in Eastern European history was very much wrapped up still in a heritage that wasn't necessarily a good heritage. And that is perspectives of how that past has impacted the communities of Eastern Europe today, right? And so that time period, which shockingly not a lot of people had studied before, and I didn't realize until I was halfway into it why they didn't study it, was wrapped up in a really painful history. It was behind some of the violence of the Balkan Wars. It was behind a policy in Bulgaria to re-Christianize over 1 million Bulgarians. And while I was doing my research, it was even behind some of the more recent populist movements in Hungary to keep out new Islamic members of their community based on kind of a misunderstanding of, this past. So really quickly, I started to realize I actually am more interested in this stuff, which is heritage. And I didn't even realize that is really where I wanted to go. My next adventure found me in the very icy corner of the world of Greenland. Here I was doing much more traditional World Heritage. I was actually at a UNESCO World Heritage site. This is the site of Asavisuit-Nipisat. It's Greenland's newest World Heritage site. It is both cultural and natural in its inscription on the World Heritage List. It is absolutely stunningly beautiful, and it is a very complicated case because of a lot of challenges that Greenland is facing. All right, and so my trip in 2001 was actually designed as a virtual field trip for my students. I was teaching at SUNY Potsdam. I actually designed this mostly because I needed an excuse to go to Greenland in the middle of November, which is when Greenland Science Week was there, and I was in the middle of classes. So I was like, well, all right, I'm just going to keep teaching my classes right along with it. So I designed this virtual field trip to get an excuse to be able to go and not get in trouble with the administration. And it ended up being a great idea because not only did it allow me to gauge the perceptions of heritage and some of the conversations we were having in Greenland from my students, but I opened it up to the public and I got to get a lot of feedback from the public. And it ended up getting us a lot of grant money from the United States Consulate, who's new to Greenland. They just reopened, and they are very interested in having the American public get more involved or knowledgeable about topics of Greenland. And so they ended up funding most of the trip. So it started as kind of an excuse to get me there, and it ended up being a really big driver. And while we were there, it was me and a Greenlandic colleague and an Icelandic colleague who was doing some heritage work. We did a whole bunch of stuff, right? So it was Greenland Science Week, which was a 2-week slew of events in Sisimiut and Nuuk, the capital of Greenland. And we were trying to explore heritage and ideas of heritage, but our Greenlandic colleague had said, well, we had been brainstorming for like a year of different stuff we could do. He had said, we really need to get over here and talk to people to see how things work in Greenland. It just runs differently. And so we were there really kind of trying to gauge people's perceptions of heritage, whether or not how they would react to like tech-heavy heritage, right? So Alice is an archaeological animator, illustrator, and she does a lot of 3D modeling. So you can see she's creating some digital 3D models of objects, of heritage objects, to get an idea of how do people feel about this, right? Is it uncomfortable for certain objects to be in digital form? Is it valuable to them, right? And so we were just meeting with a whole bunch of different people, getting different ideas about heritage, and asking a lot of questions about some of what heritage is going to look like in the coming years. Greenland is under immense pressure from both climate shift and a about to blow up tourism industry. And so heritage is kind of in the middle of both of those, and will need to be addressed. Some very important questions and concerns will need to be addressed in the coming years, right? Making the community a part of that is a priority. And so we were doing a lot of talking and communicating and workshopping with different members of the community. Right. I put this picture up here because actually I'm constantly surprised in my own work. I was surprised in Eastern Europe, and then I was surprised again in Greenland. As I was there, kind of happenstance, decided to do some really informal interviews. And this is when I started discovering I'm actually really interested in intangible heritage as well. I was there as an archaeologist. I was all about the artifacts and the heritage site until I started talking to people and discovering some really fascinating things about intangible heritage, right? So the woman up in the far corner, her name is Maria. She is one of very few teachers who teach the traditional form of creating Inuit clothing. And she's the only sewing school in the Inuit world that makes traditional clothing and teaches its craft, right? And it's in a very small red building up in Sisimiut, Greenland. Their capacity is extremely limited. They have an extremely small number of teachers. This art form takes over 2 years to make 3 sets of clothing. The students learn how to make a woman's dress, a male's clothing, and a child's dress, and it takes them 2 years to do the full thing, from skinning this seal skins to creating the patterns and all. And so they were very concerned, obviously, that this is a dying art and that it's going to be lost. And there's so much history and meaning in the creation of this clothing that they're trying to find ways to revitalize it, right? The man to her left, Bars is a carver. He carves from traditional materials. You can see some of his art right there. He carves from materials that are actually, some of them are endangered. So polar bear tusks and antler reindeer, narwhal tusks, right? And so that's a complicated issue too, because it's an indigenous art. It's they're threatened species. There's agreements with the government. They have limits to what they can actually use. For example, a polar bear has to have already been killed in order to use its claws. They don't actually kill the polar bears. But it is again, another form of intangible heritage that's facing a lot of change, a lot of questions of vitality. And I was incredibly fascinated by it when I was there. Okay. My most recent project has actually also surprised me. I didn't expect to be doing heritage in urban parks, but that is where I am right now. Right, so I've started to do 2 projects in Western New York, and they are surrounded by questions of heritage and how they can be helpful and employed in the development of really solid urban parks. And in these parks, there's really a heavy element, not just of the past and preserving the past, but of the present, what we're doing right now, and what the future is going to look at these parks. So the example I'll give you, the one I'll talk the most about, is Ralph Wilson Park, because I'm really in the middle of this one right now. This is a 100-acre park along the shores of Lake Erie in Buffalo. It's the 3rd park to sit in this location, so it's actually relatively young land, right? So in heritage, we tend to think of really, really old places, and a lot of the places I've worked have been really, really old. But in this case, I'm being challenged with thinking about presenting the past and teaching history when the history isn't all that old to begin with. It is undergoing a $110 million transformation. It is a community-driven transformation. It was started with a community focus group. They brought in representatives of all of the communities who currently use the park that's standing there now. They flew them to examples of world-class parks around the country. They went to Detroit, they went to Central Park in New York City, they went to Chicago, right, to discover just how great an urban park can be when you have a very large amount of money to put into it. Right. It is not only a community-driven initiative, it is an environmentally driven initiative. It is an area of significant concern. The shoreline instability is threatening the water supply to the city of Buffalo. It is in the Great Lakes area of concern. These are federal designations around the country that we've been trying to fix, right? These problematic areas around the Great Lakes since I think the 1980s when they were designated. Some with more success than others, right? So this park is right in one of those. And there is the scientific modeling that's showing that the storms coming off of Lake Erie are going to get more and more extreme to the point that this park will essentially cease to exist in probably 10 to 15 years if nothing is done. So there's a lot going on with this. And they wanted me to use heritage as a tool, right? To help connect the communities, to help communicate change, right? Because change at places that have always been there is not always received warmly. It can be really hard for people to accept. And to just connect them and try to build stewards at this urban green space, right? To create a place of heritage because of the history, but even more so because of the present and the future. So remember in the beginning, I said heritage isn't just something we've inherited from the past. It's what we're doing today that we'll leave as a legacy, we'll leave as heritage. Right. And so the idea here is how this $110 million renovation can create a legacy that will last for many generations in downtown Buffalo. So they wanted me to use a heritage approach to advance multiple goals at multiple levels. At the local level, to help bolster the neighboring community. It sits next to communities that have some of the lowest socioeconomic status in the city, right? These are kids who do not have access to quality parks right now, who will soon have access to amazing play spaces and green spaces. Kind of communicating the value of that, right? The science that shows that kids who are exposed to who have access to really high quality green spaces, their future will be forever changed by that, right? They have a lifetime of health and mental well-being benefits that come from access to green spaces. So that's creating heritage, right? Giving an entire generation a better future because of access to nature and wildlife and play spaces. Connecting it to regional goals, right? Wrapping it into the Great Lakes, right? The Great Lakes are unquestionably one of the most unparalleled and amazing natural resources in the world. I dare you to argue with me. We just don't treat them like that, unfortunately, and we haven't. So let's, but there are a lot of people who are trying to get people to realize that we sit on such an amazing piece of natural heritage. We've inherited it. We've inherited its problems, but what we do today will tell us what we're going to leave as legacy in the future. And then global, right? I'm actually connecting this work with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. These are 17 goals that the UN has put forth as priorities on a global scale to create a better future for as many people as possible. Sustainable Development Goal number 11 is building better cities, right? This is an urban city. It's right in the downtown. And two of its targets are creating better green spaces, access to better green spaces for urban populations, and protecting and safeguarding cultural and natural heritage, right? So an urban park that prioritizes heritage does both of these things, right? So this is linked to a much grander global initiative to build better cities. Right. So what am I doing? Currently, I am writing content, monthly blog articles, newsletter content, newsletters that go out to not just people in Buffalo, but people who are interested in this transformation in general. It is a very large transformation, obviously by the cost and the scale. It is not just funded by the Ralph Wilson Foundation, who has taken on the park has taken the name from. It's also funded by the Army Corps of Engineers, the EPA, NOAA, and another of other federal and state agencies who are putting in money because of some of the environmental pieces in there. Right. And so we're reaching out to all the stakeholders and trying to build this idea of heritage at an urban park. And so This right now is what we've started. This is the landing page. You guys, I mentioned there is a handout right by the sign up sheet you're welcome to take that gives you the code that will bring you to this page to read some of what I've written. Right. The content is trying to do a lot of things, right? So I'm trying to explore history. I'm putting forth interesting historical pictures and events that have happened at the park or that is related to the park, trying to share the relevant science because the science is how we are trying to build something that will be resilient enough to last into the future, that won't face some of the threats that the current park has faced, that has been deteriorating the shoreline, the natural heritage, some of the plants, water bird species, things like that. Build a park narrative that focuses on all three timescales, past, present, and future. Reviews current changes in the light of heritage building. A lot of trees had to be taken down in one area. It was not well received by the community to see these big, beautiful trees that have taken decades to grow, and they had to come down, right? But the reason they had to come down, right, are good. Right. And so they have to build up the shoreline so that it is resilient. They are repopulating the whole park with native species that will support not just native plants, but native birds, native animals. Right. But this has to be communicated. Right. Change is hard in the short term. Right. But it's going to lead to beautiful and an amazing park in the long term. So trying to communicate that, encourage the connection to the land, and hopefully build stewardship. Once it's done, we want the neighboring communities to take care of it, to see it as something extremely valuable. Right. I'm trying to also explore other ways to communicate around this project. I am aware that not everybody is on social media and not everybody reads newsletters and blogs, right? And so that is a very strong feeling of mine that I'm only reaching one demographic and one type of person, or not one, but kind of a narrow demographic there. And I want to figure out how to change that. So I am exploring some kind of K through 12 ideas, some in-person programming when the park reopens, which is probably going to be another year. And then alternative forms of digital content. This right here is a micro course I'm playing with. That's going to basically be, you take your phone, you scan it pops up a little course, and it'll teach you 5 plants you'll meet in the park, trying to teach people about the natural heritage, right? The other one I'm working on is 5 days in history at the park. Just 5 interesting pieces of history that happened in this park. It's interactive, it's got flashcards, it's got pictures. It'll take a total of 5 minutes to do, right? So the idea is people who engage more on their phones and who might need something more interactive and less text heavy, like a blog article. And so this project was really I wasn't planning to go into any other urban parks with this. I was just exploring heritage in this urban park. But then it turns out that it might be relevant elsewhere as well. The Governor Hochul announced a new state park, I think 1 or 2 years ago. It's going to be at High Falls in downtown Rochester. And I was approached by those who are doing the public communication for the High Falls State Park, right? And who are very interested in using heritage from the onset of designing the state park. It's not designed yet, so it's in the very beginning stages of gathering community input and ideas about how this park should lay out, but it's going to be a 40-acre park at the bottom of High Falls in downtown Rochester, right? They want a heritage approach, or at least heritage ideas, to be incorporated from the very beginning, right? And so it happens to sit in a historic district, the Browns Race District of Rochester. It is on the National Register of Historic Places. They want that part of the park, right? They want this kind of part of the programming, and they want a similar idea to bring forth the past, but also to say, hey, what we're doing in the money that's going to be used to renovate this park is so that we have a legacy for the future of Rochester as well. So I will be speaking on one of Rochester's radio stations in 2 weeks. I will be presenting at the gala, Reflections on the River, August 1st, all about getting people to think about heritage in the context of this urban park. Again, not somewhere that a lot of heritage conversations necessarily have, but it turns out pretty powerful one if you're thinking about the future. Yes, go ahead.
So the 40 acres, what have they been used for in the past?
So right now, when you're in Rochester, you can see the falls from high above, but nobody has access to the river level, right? So this is the Genesee River, runs through the city. It is, I believe, RG&E has facilities down there, a electric company. Yes, has a electric company. So it's very kind of industrial down there. I forgot what the plant is, but no public is allowed down there. So they are decommissioning all of the industrial buildings down there. They're going to be, so that's what's happening now. And then it's going to be opened up to the public for the first time, I think, in 100 years maybe. So, and the park will be down below. Mm-hmm. Right. And so these, so as I mentioned, through a lot of different projects at you guys, right? So these are some of the areas that I've worked. I think that all of them reveal some interesting stuff about heritage, right? That it is very different. It looks different in different places. It means something different to different people, right? It doesn't have to be just about preservation. It can be about modernization as well. It can be about balancing. In some cases, I would argue just straight preservation isn't going to work, right? In certain areas of Greenland, just trying to preserve things, it's not going to work, right? There's too much threat. There's too much saying that some of these places will not survive unless change happens. So balancing preservation with change is an incredibly important point to make. Not all of them are very old. Heritage doesn't have to be 1,000 years old to be meaningful. History doesn't have to be, 5,000 years old to be meaningful, right? People find meaning in things that are a few decades old, places that have history in their lifetime, right? It doesn't have to be incredibly old. And then it can highlight both natural and cultural, right? We're not just talking archaeological ruins, we're talking parks or places that support natural heritage. It can ground people in the face of rapidly changing, it can ground people in the face of rapid change, right? And so in many places, our heritage projects are very meaningful to people who are facing a lot of change, like rural areas of Greenland, right? Making sure that they can protect parts of their past, that they can modernize and keep doing some of their practices that are at risk is incredibly important when they're looking at the next couple of years being, or the next couple of decades being incredibly different all over the country. Same at an urban park, right? It might be hard for them to see the closing of a park that their kids have played Little League at for literally for generations, right? But in the face of all of that change can be something beautiful coming, right? And so it can kind of ground people and create stewards of place, right? Connecting people to land, even if they're not from there, right? You don't have to have ancestry to a land to feel roots to a land, to become naturalized to a place, right? You can do that even if you are from somewhere else or your ancestry is from somewhere else. Something that is often the struggle for a lot of Americans, right? Is if your ancestry is from somewhere else, right? Do we have the same kind of deep ties or roots to our land, right? The argument is certainly yes, and heritage can help us feel that way, right? No matter how old those roots are. So what about the North Country, right? And so all of my work, I will be very blunt. All of my work is outside the North Country, right? But I think that all of these lessons could be brought here and can continue conversations I know that are already happening with the organizations that do heritage work up here. Right. So the North Country is an incredible location, right? It is filled with culture and it's filled with natural heritage, right? So it's got both elements, right? Being a part of the Great Lakes system means it's part of that Great Lakes heritage. Being a part of the North Country, that's the National Park Service. They advertise the North Country as being really across all 8 states, as being this region that has excellent, adventure in nature and heritage, right? So it's incredible. It has such incredible cultural and natural heritage, right? That can just continue to be used to benefit the people who live here. Right. And so there's a lot of questions that I had as I was going through my work that I've done and thinking about how does this connect or how could this connect to the North Country, right? And there's always this question, how could we do more, right? How could we expand, right? So who is not, what new audience could be reached in natural and cultural heritage work that's happening in North Country right now? How can we add projects where they're not currently considered, right? What about the Downtown Revitalization Initiative? You better believe I was on their little survey as soon as I was writing this, being like, can you consider heritage in everything you do? Right? So can we build heritage in places that we haven't been building it so far, where change is happening, right? Can we balance change and preservation in a cool way, right? And how can we then tell people about the benefits of natural and cultural heritage, right? To get them more involved. How can we tell people that building more parks, right? Or building or protecting more historical sites can benefit their kids and can benefit them, right? For a much longer part of their life. And a couple more questions. Who are we not reaching, right? Are there people that aren't attending heritage events, right? Are there is this a generational split? what elements of heritage are least well known, right? Are there parts of our history that are not being elevated? A fellow mom up at Banford said something about how she was surprised that there's less obvious indicators of the Underground Railroad around, right? We have this really interesting history. Are we playing it up enough, right? Are we making it as big of a deal and connecting people to it? What medias have we yet to employ? I mentioned I'm experimenting with micro courses in person, right? Are there any other ways that we can try to branch out? And then what resources are underutilized or funding sources underutilized? These are questions that every heritage person has probably asked many times. Carlene's probably like, I've asked this many, many times, right? But just kind of continuing this conversation, maybe looking at like what's being done. And like, I saw actually a lot of parallels in Greenland, oddly enough, right? Because of the environment, because of the smaller communities, right? Because a lot of North Country people actually are from the North Country. So I found a lot of shocking parallels while I was working there as here, probably more so than I did in the urban parks context or the Eastern European context, right? Right. And so there I was surprised to find some funding sources we didn't think about. I had no idea the US consulate had these grants. We kind of stumbled upon them, right? So what other grants out there haven't we figured out that we can kind of tap into, right? So I don't have the answers to any of these questions for you guys. I would love to, if anyone has any of them, but I kind of wanted to just stop there, right? So these are the things that I started thinking about in terms of how my work can kind of connect or think about different initiatives in the North Country. Does anybody work in heritage or have any thoughts to these? No? Okay. Okay, well then, yes. Beautiful country.
The gears that come into my mind, so we have anybody who has a lot of contention around solar fields and program that. Got me thinking about environmental heritage and how many other areas have land banks and conservation easements are super common. And I think many of the folks who are allowing solar on their property are doing so as a necessity. So when you have a piece of land or a viewshed that's particularly important, you could come at it from a heritage perspective to say we're going to seek out conservation easements to keep land agricultural or to prevent certain sorts of development. So it's not really so much a question, it's just now you've got my gears turning in different directions.
Yeah, and it's a hard, it's again, there's a parallel in Greenland, right? And that is, there is this hard balance between encouraging protection and preservation and being understanding that people have to do what they have to do, right? And so in Greenland, it's kind of the tourism question. The tourists are coming and the indicators are going to be in masses. They don't have the capacity for them, and it's because of that, when you don't have the capacity for that many incomers, it's going to be quite destructive, right? But how do you tell them to turn away, right? They struggle with their gross domestic product. It's still largely funded by the Kingdom of Denmark, right? So that's wrapped up into some independence questions, right? So how do you tell them to turn away from this modern source of income if it's threatening preservation, right? So I'd see some parallels there too, because I think that's what's happening, right? But so how do you build and encourage keeping a stronghold on the farming identity of North Country, right? Because that's one of the biggest things that's at risk right now, is because it's farmland that's turning into the solar fields, right? And if we lose that, we do lose that kind of farming tradition, right? That history of being a strong agricultural, community, right? I don't have an answer, but I agree with you. It's something that, when thinking about heritage, right, you have to also think about the threats to heritage, right? Which is modernization and change, and in this case up here, certainly the solar fields.
I'm reading a fascinating book right now called The Tree Thieves, which takes place in Washington State, and it's basically about people who are illegally cutting down, ancient forests and harvesting the wood by the dead of night in these protected areas. And there's many challenges to stopping that happening. Number one, it's too big of a space. There's no way to regulate it. But a lot of people that are doing this are people who've lived in that area for many generations, and the preservation of the parks, and as that land has sort of encroached upon the industries that used to be there, and there's now no money. So it's she's an investigative reporter who's writing the story, and it's fascinating it's like the indigenous perspective often gets left out of these stories. The local people who, you know, when a government agency or something comes in and says they're going to preserve something, if their perspective isn't being considered, then the people that are actually damaging something that they should love because it's their backyard are the people that live there because their voice wasn't in the conversation. So I think these issues are so complicated for that reason. And I think, you know, ties to the North Country, you know, as an outsider here, I've noticed that like people are very passionate about, you know, this area where they grew up and the heritage that they have. But when somebody comes in from the outside, like a solar farm saying, you know, we're capitalizing on this natural resource you have, people are going to fight against that, as you know, they would. That's their livelihood that's being threatened, but it's also a way of life that isn't practical anymore for the larger world. So there's no easy answer to these questions. How do we balance these tough, like the preservation of the planet, but also incorporating the people,
the modernization, what's needed,
right?
Yeah.
Who have the most stakes in that particular preserved. And they're not against preserving it necessarily, but it's just to cut them out totally of the conversation and causes a lot of these problems. So it's fascinating, like reading this book and me think like, okay, I always thought, you know, those people are the bad guys, but it's not that simple. That
yeah, it's a lot, and that's one of the hard parts about is it can be heritage work. It's trying to fix that can sometimes actually make it work if the right people aren't benefiting from the heritage, you know, right? So there's cases in which you know, indigenous art or designs are being sold to increase, you know, a heritage industry or heritage tourism, but the money's not going necessarily to the people. As in Greenland, one of the issues is not the cruise ships that are going to be coming and docking. At least right now, the money isn't actually going to the towns they're going to be docking in, right? So they're going to be dumping, you know, thousands of people onto the shores, but the money is going centrally to the government far away, not to the community where the, you know, so yeah. So there's, you know, it is a struggle all around the world, right? But I still think it's something that can not combat change, like stop it, right? But it can just make it so that the change is more incorporated into the existing identity and history and feelings of the people who are there, right? When done well, it can be amazing. When done bad, it can be pretty sad. Any other thoughts or gears or questions? Yeah.
I have some thoughts, but I don't know if everybody's going to hear all of it.
Give me one.
I worked in the dairy industry in this county for like 30 years or better, among other things I've done. You have a book upstairs. I think there were like 400 family farms in St. Lawrence County back in the 1930s. And they were having trouble during the Depression, and they had a dairy farmers union that was formed. And the man that was the head of the union was basically blacklisted by everybody that could. And there's articles in the Quarterly about that back a number of years ago. But then with the advent of the St. Lawrence Seaway, that put a number of small farms out of business then. And then through the 1950s and into the 1960s, a lot of them were struggling. And I got involved with this in the 1980s, and I picked up milk at well over 100 different family farms in St. Lawrence County. And this was already in the era of bulk tanks, which when that came out, that put a lot of farms out of business because the bulk tank cost almost as much as a farm in the beginning. But there were still well over 100 dairy farms I picked up. And I would say 90% of them are out of business now. And a lot of them have just gone out of business in the last 10 or 15 years. And I think that's the biggest tragedy I've seen in this area. And we have a few mega dairies that actually probably are producing more milk than all the family farms did. But I don't think it's a great idea. That's my own opinion on that. But these solar panel things that are just something relatively new here, and I see they're going in here, there, and everywhere. And that's pretty upsetting because I think the lifespan of those solar panels is maybe 20 or 30 years. And then what happens to them then?
Mhm.
Are they just gonna be left there to,
Well, I did hear that their lease, I think is, you're right, 20 to 30 years. And that's a good question. Are they going to be removed for the companies that put them? I don't know. Do you know the answer?
They have
They have to be commissioning. Okay. Right. Either more will go in or they will come out. Right.
Okay, well, that's good.
Yeah. So,
The other thing are the backup fires. That's another concern,
Mhm.
but I just hate to see our farmland being used for such a thing.
Mhm.
Myself, and I personally don't think it's going to solve any problems as far as, electricity goes. That's my own opinion. I'm just glad we don't have all the wind towers. Because they were planning to put wind towers in Hammond, and they were planning to put them over in Stockholm, I think.
the solar panels are a little lower. Yeah. So I will say, I want to make I say this. I think that change has always happened, right? Like as an archaeologist, humans have always faced change and they've always had to move with it. And there's nothing different about the modern time. It's a past, right? I do think change is speeding up, right? And I think a lot of people do. There's a few things that have increased the rate of speed. And perhaps increase the threat to the way things are, the things that people do, how we interact with each other, how, our culture, our cultural norms all around the world, I think are going to change faster unless we make some decisions.